The first train into Sarasota. The previous stories of the first train into Sarasota maligned the existence and ability of the railroad. This story comes from the articles of the Manatee River Journal that recorded the accomplishments and the tragedies of the Arcadia, Gulf Coast, and Lakeland Railroad, which the paper nicknamed Old Pete. The background picture is a modern copy of the McQueen 4-4-0 locomotive, the same type of railroad engine that was the first into Sarasota. A few years after J. Hamilton Gillespie came to Sarasota from Scotland to manage the Florida Mortgage and Investment Company, he was trying to find a way to attract investors and visitors. He noticed that towns and cities that had train stops grew faster than those without. He went into Braidentown, now Braidenton, Board of Trade and convinced some investors to incorporate the Manatee and Sarasota Railway and Drainage Company in November of 1889 with a capital stock amounting to $50,000. The Braidentown Board of Trade and the Manatee County Commissioners ordered that any line or lines of railroads which may hereafter be built and operated within the county of Manatee to or from the Manatee River points within the next 2 years shall, from the time of completion of said line or lines of railroads for business, be exempt from taxation for a period of 5 years. Gillespie had to travel back to Scotland during February and March of 1890 to get the Florida Mortgage Investment Company's blessing before he could move forward. In April, he arrived back with the company's blessings and hired an engineer, J. O. Hunley, to identify 2 possible routes between Sarasota and the Manatee River. The company then would determine the best route. The Braidentown Board of Trade had talked to the Tampa Board of Trade to see if they were interested in working with them to put a railroad line from Tampa to Braidentown, and introduced a bill in the Florida House of Representatives asking for a land grant for the Manatee and Sarasota Railway and Drainage Company, but to no avail. In June of 1891, the railroad company was struggling to get off the ground, still working at getting donation, rights of way, etc., when a new company made itself known. John Cross from Arcadia scheduled a meeting at the Braidentown Courthouse to inform the public about the future incorporation of the Arcadia, Gulf Coast, and Lakeland Railroad Company, which would be backed with capital stock of $1.5 million and would have railroad connections from Lakeland to Boca Grande. The president of the company was Anthony Peters of Anthony Peters and Sons in Boston. At the end of the meeting, the citizens voted in favor of a free grant of right-of-way through the county and also pledged a unanimous moral and financial support in aid of the construction thereof. Note, John Cross was the founder of Grove City below Englewood in 1886 and by one account named Lemon Bay. During the summer of 1891, the AGC and LRR company sent out surveyors to map out the planned routes both north and south of the Manatee River. In early September, Gillespie of Sarasota and H.C. Patton of Braidentown met with John Cross to discuss the transferring of the Manatee River and Sarasota Railroad charter to the AGC&L, thereby ensuring the construction of the Lakeland Road from Braidentown through Sarasota to Boca Grande. By the end of October, the charter was purchased. The Florida Mortgage and Investment Company offered a further inducement. If the railroad is completed between Braidentown and Sarasota by February 21st of 1892, the AGC and L will be entitled to 10,000 acres of land, and each consecutive 20 miles completed will also entitle them to certain state lands for which the law provides. The route was 11.8 miles long, starting from the Manatee River at Braidentown and entering Sarasota on Lemon Avenue, turning on Strawberry Avenue to the shore. The depot to be situated on Lemon Avenue near Main Street. Other publications have the depot located about 100 feet west of Orange Avenue near 10th Street, way out in the woods. It was reported in the Manatee River Journal on December 24th that the contractors of the AGC&L arrived Tuesday with workmen, tools, etc. Work on the Sarasota branch has been commenced. 200 teams of mules and about 400 men are in transit, and this branch will positively be completed before March 1st. On December 31st, it was reported Mr. Garburi, chief contractor, said the engine, flat cars, etc. will be brought down on lighters and the rails will arrive on January 15th. Note, the Manatee River Journal dated 31 December 1891 stated, a construction train of an engine, 6 flat cars, and a caboose has been ordered to be on the river within a week. We'll find later that the construction train ended up being the passenger and freight train. Garburi and Armstrong knew the deadline for completing the Braidentown to Sarasota line was February 21st to get the land bonus offered by the FMIC. Most likely, their contract with Anthony Peters had a clause about this date. He poured laborers into the road and prayed the locomotive cars and rail would get there on time. When he arrived in Braidentown, he found that they hadn't assigned a right-of-way through the town, and he threatened the town citizens that he would move the start of the line to Manatee if they didn't assign a right-of-way within the next day. Braidentown had 3 possible roads to assign, but only one could be assigned in a day without legal recourse. However, the street did not have the required width, lacked 10 feet on either side of the required width, and it caused legal problems later. It was learned that Garburi's threat was a hoax, but it worked to get things started. As mentioned before, Garburi and Armstrong hired laborers and threw them at the work. However, he didn't have enough managers and the workers got into trouble. Several trees in an orange orchard were picked clean of fruit and spare parts were thrown around the track. They were planning on using the locomotive to help lay the rails. The Arcadia, Gulf Coast, and Lakeland Railroad contracted with J.A. Garburi and R.T. Armstrong to purchase the railroad cars and rails and to build the stretch of tracks from Braidentown to Sarasota as the first piece of their railroad empire. The locomotive acquired had been built at the Schenectady Locomotive Works in Schenectady, New York, probably around 1870. It was a McQueen type 440 passenger style gauge locomotive with a 16 by 24 inch cylinder. The engine was lettered Anthony Peters and AGC and LRR. Under careful scrutiny, NYC and HRR, standing for New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, was plainly outlined beneath its recent lettering. My assumption is that faster engines replaced this one, and it was sidelined and available. Along with the engine, 6 flat cars were purchased, each 31 feet long and 15-ton capacity, all lettered AGC and LRR, and numbered from 1 to 6. Garburi and Armstrong bought the engine and cars from the New York Equipment Company on December 30th, 1891. Note, the first several of the McQueen 440 type were used in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The locomotive pictured ran for the New York City and Hudson River Railroad, as did Old Pete, prior to its service for the AGC and LRR. The rails weighed 60 pounds to the foot and bore the stamp Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The contract was for 80 miles of track, 11.8 miles of which were for the Braidentown-Sarasota line. The road will be built in the most durable manner possible, broad gauge, heavily railed, and upon ties 7 by 9 and 9 feet in length. This is a McQueen American Type 440 locomotive coming off the line at Schenectady Locomotive Works in 1868. 440 means it has a two-axle truck to help guide it into the curves and two driving axles coupled by a connecting rod. In English, this is the wheel configuration. The Manatee River Journal, February 11, 1892. The engine landed. A great event in the county's history was the landing of the AGC&L Railroad's first engine at Braidentown last Friday in tow of the tug Moonlight. An appreciative audience viewed the spectacle, and if they did not cheer enthusiastically, it was because of a feeling of awe of this monster of steel controlled them. When still far down the river, the engine was critically examined by several telescopes from the different wharfs, and many conclusions arrived at of its size, capacity, and place of manufacture. On its arrival, the barge was swung abreast of the wharf. A truck hastily laid the length of the wharf some distance on shore, and the outer end raised to the level of the barge. The engine under a partial head of steam and the throttle valve directed by engineer T.W. Nichols slowly moved off the barge, down the short incline, and out upon the wharf. The whistle screamed out the tidings of success, and the three steamboats in the river took up the refrain until the echoes of the neighborhood rang again. By mid-month of January 1892, several miles of roadbed had been partially completed, and a wharf was being built to receive the rails. By January 21st, the railroad grading had been completed halfway to Sarasota, and part of its length had been leveled. The next week increased the grading by 2 miles. Bridging was underway, and the first rails arrived, which were placed along the route to be used to lay the track when the engine and cars arrived. The two depots are being built by Martin and Frank, each measuring 20 by 30 feet, with a platform on each side of 8 feet. The depot in Braidentown was directly south of the intersection of the railroad and Manatee Avenue. The depot in Sarasota, as mentioned before, was planned to be at Lemon Avenue and Main Street. With the arrival of the locomotive and the regular steel gang the following Thursday, the rails were being laid. No plates came in on the load on Sunday the 14th, so work had to stop until Wednesday the 17th. By that time, 5.5 miles of road had been laid. To make the deadline of the 22nd, they had to work all out, and about 4 p.m. on the 21st, the last rail was laid and the engine stood in front of the Sarasota depot. The next day, the railroad was officially opened. However, in rushing through to meet the deadline, the ties and rails were thrown down without proper ballast, grading, leveling, and surfacing of the road. In the newspaper, the locomotive got a nickname of Old Pete because the engine was truly old, and the president of the railroad was Anthony Peters. But because of the rush job laying the tracks, the train would wobble where the ground was not stable, and the nickname of the railroad in later publications was the Slow and Wobbly. Preparing for the opening day and not having any passenger coaches arrive, none never did, several of the best carpenters fitted a top seat, etc., to one of the flat cars. On opening day, about 40 passengers took the inaugural trip from Braidentown to Sarasota, including John Cross and his wife, Mr. Garbury and Armstrong, J.H. Powers, the chief engineer, Mr. Martin and Frank, who were responsible for a large part of the grading, Mr. Walker, who supervised the road's construction, J.H. Humphreys, representing the Tampa Press, and Mr. W.R. Fuller, Jr., representing the FC&P Railroad, which brought down the rails, hands, and other requisites. The inaugural trip took 1 hour and 9 minutes. Note the flared smokestack on the engine. This was a spark arrestor fitting over the standard smokestack. A later picture of Old Pete shows the smokestack without the spark arrestor. There were both positive and negative occurrences for the railroad. I will dwell on the positive first and return to the negative in a later segment. On February 25th, a regular schedule for the AGC&L was published in the Manatee River Journal. This schedule ran in the paper through May 5th of 1892. During this time, the newspaper reported several special excursions. There were 4 excursions reported in the newspaper for March, including a large party from Williamsonburg, now part of Braidentown, 80 persons for the Ladies' Aid Society of Manatee, and one that included an 85-year-old Madam Jo Atzeroth, who had been a pioneer on Terracea, and 2 young ladies that came close to losing their dinner. In April, Tampa listed regular excursions from Tampa to Sarasota and back using steamboats and Old Pete for $1.50 round trip. Even after the railroad schedule had stopped in the paper, excursions continued. However, at the beginning of June, the water supplies were drying up, and for a short time, water was drawn from F.N. Horton's private wells. The 4th of July celebrations changed locations from year to year, but in 1892 it was held in Braidentown. Old Pete set up special excursion times for the people of Sarasota to travel to Braidentown for the celebration. The financial problems finally caught up with the railroad, and at the beginning of July the train was locked up until July 26 when Engineer Nichols unlocked Old Pete and made a trip to Sarasota. Engineer Nichols left the area and the railroad in late September looking for better employment. During the summer and into October, excursions were the main use of the railroad, especially baseball excursions. One particular baseball excursion was followed by a musicale entertainment at the DeSoto Hotel in Sarasota featuring J. Hamilton Gillespie on his Aeolian organ. Before the arrival of the railroad authorities last Saturday, Mr. Morgan and Lang had a very good scheme in hand to run a daily schedule to Sarasota and with the receipts from the orange traffic to buy a forward truck which the engine needs badly. It was reported that Mr. Morgan and Mr. Lang were starting regular Wednesday and Saturday trips to Sarasota. This was also the time Old Pete delivered more than people. It was citrus season and 5,000 orange boxes had been pledged to move from Sarasota to Braidentown. On November 22nd, over 2 carloads of oranges were sent to Braidentown. At this time, 2 new pair of engine trucks were put in place. The newspaper reported that prior to December 21st, the railroad delivered 3,965 packages, the bulk being oranges, from Sarasota to Fuller's Wharf in Braidentown. It was stated in Ghost Railroads of Sarasota County by Elmer G. Sulzer, for the year ending December 31st, 1892, the railroad received an income of $4,152 from passengers, $8,450 from freight, and $948 from other sources, for a total of $13,560. Expenses, bills that were paid for the year amounted to $7,046, leaving net earnings of $6,504. With that extra money, they started working on improving the surfacing of the road. Sarasota excursions were scheduled from December 24th through January 3rd for 50 cents a round trip. Surfacing and grading of the track continued into the new year, but stopped within 2 miles of Sarasota because of pay issues on January 21st of 1893. As of April 1893, Mr. Nichols and Mr. Lang were still paid employees of the railroad. Mr. T.C. Taliaferro, the cashier of the First National Bank of Tampa, was named as receiver of the railroad. This was the first time Mr. Taliaferro was involved in Manatee County and Sarasota, but not the last time. Later, he will work with Ralph Capels to try to bring a train into Sarasota from Tampa. He also started a bank in Braidentown and Sarasota, the Bank of Sarasota. His philosophy with Old Pete was to utilize the equipment with runs instead of locking the engine and cars down while litigation was taking place. He gave his assurance that the engine will be put in repair and leave Sarasota regularly at 9:30 a.m. and will haul anything and everything in the county. The spring and early summer had excursions for baseball, a musical entertainment at Sarasota in May at the DeSoto, and a benefit excursion for the Methodist Church to Sarasota for fishing, picnicking, and surf bathing at New Pass. In the summer, Mr. Morgan and Mr. Lang, who had been associated with Old Pete, left for more lucrative jobs in Tampa. Now Mr. Nichols and Mr. St. Amand make up the railroad team. Note, I believe this is the same St. Amand that homesteaded today's St. Armands. Starting in July, the engine was busy hauling logs for the Stanton Milling Company near Braidentown and preparing to run citrus again for the fall. It was suggested that the railroad should convert a flat car into a box car for the orange crop. In September of 1893, a new schedule was put in effect, the train leaving Sarasota at 7:30 a.m. and leaving Braidentown at 4 p.m. Every few days, Old Pete would be hauling timber to the mill, and in October, boxes of oranges for the Braidentown wharf. It was even available for emergency calls, coming into Braidentown in the middle of the night to fetch Dr. Leffingwell so he could treat Mrs. Helveston in Sarasota. It had been rumored that the Florida Peninsula and Gulf Railroad had bought the railroad, but the newspaper only used the name once for Old Pete. On November 9th of 1893, they claimed the FP&G Railroad brought up over 1,300 boxes of oranges from Sarasota during the previous week and over 400 boxes on Saturday. The railroad was shut down the first part of 1894, and the engine was sold for $600 to the New York Equipment Company. However, the new owners believed it was better to let an experienced engineer run the engine from Sarasota and return once a day and keep it in good repair than to leave it at the mercy of the weather and small boys. The receiver, Mr. Taliaferro, expressed his willingness that this daily trip be made if a guarantee was made that no expense shall be incurred by him. However, except for one or two excursions, the train remained idle until someone posted a $5,000 bond. That person was W.R. Fuller, Jr. in mid-June. The railroad crew, Nichols and Duckwall, were willing to run Old Pete for what they could make. Some repairs were made to the track and they were ready for the new schedule. At the end of June 1894, the AGC&L started making a single round trip from Sarasota to Braidentown, carrying wood to Braidentown and the mail to Sarasota. On July 12th, they started a new schedule with 2 trips a day. This schedule was published in the Manatee River Journal weekly with minor variations until February of 1895. Through August of 1894, the main reported railroad commerce was logs for the mill. In December, again the railroad was sold, but until they started dismantling the railroad, it was announced it will be run on in the old way. But alas, all good things come to an end. The schedule was not printed in the paper starting in February of 1895, and no excursions were reported. The loose spikes and fish plates were the first to go, and by May the track was being torn up. In the June 20th of 1895 edition of the Manatee River Journal, it was printed, "And so old Peter, faithful, powerful, obedient old servant, its prescribed track torn away and its usefulness among us forever at an end, sometime between Sunday and Monday, gave one last, long, wild cry of grief and despair, and then silently passed out into the quiet night. The quantity of iron held to secure the Tallahassee Bank and 1 car is all that remains of the AGC&L except for the roadbed." Now the litigation battles and other setbacks. March 3rd of 1892, the railroad made a cut 6 feet in depth alongside the west end of the Stanton Mill. They were fined $1,003. On March 24th, there was a fire in the woods that burned 500 railroad ties. April 2nd, and Anthony Peters, president of the AGC&L, was assigned liability of a default of a $10,000 note. April 14th, contractors have not paid off their workers. July 7th, A sheriff's sale of the railroad to satisfy suits amounts for individual suits from Cal Morris, Will Davis, Jolly Wall, Adam Wilson, George B. Cox, Will Mark, Zeke Whitman, Thomas J.S. Lewis, A.A. Taylor, Robert S. Payne, Henry Jones, and Alan Hickman. Sale date scheduled for the first Monday of August of 1892, and he padlocked the train. August 1st came, and the sheriff's sale was postponed. In September, all claimants were promised payment, $25,000 to cover all claims, and the suits were again postponed to the first Monday of November. In October of 1892, word was that Anthony Peters & Sons' business failed. President Peters, in contracting with Mr. Garbury and Armstrong for the building of the road, was evidently misled by them as to the actual cost of construction, and the contract as let to them was far above any reasonable estimate. So when it became necessary to find outside money to float the bonds, no money was forthcoming to build railroads at such a cost. Garbury and Armstrong, although pressing for what they are owed, have given up the contract for building the line from Lakeland to Boca Grande. In November, the name Anthony Peters was taken off the engine. In December, a commission was summoned by Sheriff Watson to evaluate the sum of AGC&L, O, Garbury, and Armstrong. As reported in the Manatee River Journal on March 23, 1893, there is lying at the railroad wharf enough iron to lay 3 more miles of road, a delivered cost of $8,400. There is enough at Port Tampa to lay about 5 miles of road, which cost $19,000. The iron on the Sarasota division cost $45,600. The Sarasota division cost to build and lay the iron $23,000, or a total of $68,600. Garbury and Armstrong have received on account from the work done on both sides of the river $20,000, yet the total amount due them for this work is $107,600. In February, the short-term work that was being done to improve the railroad tracks came to an end because of lack of pay. In April of 1893, T.C. Taliaferro of Tampa was appointed receiver by the court of the AGC&L. In the same month, the New York and Gulf Steamship Company have libeled 492 tons of steel rails that were shipped to the AGC&L at Port Tampa. They were sold to cover freight charges for $13,042 to the Southern Street Railroad Company of Tampa. In June, Frank Dryman made a claim that the graders undermined his fence and it fell down, and another had to be put up. In August, the AGC&L was assessed at $24,000 and taxed at $180. In September, J. Hamilton Gillespie said, when the road is put in proper shape, the FMIC land grant will be turned over to the receiver. He never turned the land over. In December, Garbury and Armstrong defaulted on a contract with the New York Equipment Company, the firm that supplied the engine and flat cars, and another sale of the same was scheduled for January 18, 1894. On that date, they were sold for $600 to the man that owned the company. The railroad was stopped while the future of Old Pete was being determined. By May of 1894, Old Pete was running again, hauling logs for Stanton's Mill. However, the regular schedule into Sarasota started in July. Meanwhile, the case of Garbury, Armstrong and Company versus the Arcadia Gulf Coast and Lakeland Railroad in U.S. Court in Tampa was referred to a special master, Julius Otto, who scheduled the AGC&L to be sold again on September 3rd. This date was postponed to October, then November 12th, and then December 10th, 1894. Mr. John King, representing the Garbury and Armstrong, bought the road, existing railroad track including rails and ties, for $16,000 and the loose iron for $4,200. However, there is nothing easy about the railroad. Manatee County is demanding $520 of taxes due the county, otherwise the tracks will be sold again. Garbory and Armstrong and John King didn't like the previous court ruling and sent the case to the United States Court of Appeals at New Orleans. In April of 1895, the loose rails, spikes, and fish plates were removed. Manatee County won't allow tearing up of the track until the delinquent taxes are paid. In May, John King paid nearly $1,000 of back taxes on the railroad, but the bank he wrote against collapsed, Merchants National Bank of Rome, Georgia. The Tallahassee Bank, accepting John King's check, held a quantity of iron and a railroad flat car against the check. By mid-May, the railroad line was being dismantled, and on June 20th, 1895, the Manatee River Journal published an editorial entitled "The Passing of Old Pete." You would think that was the end of the story. However, there were 26 attachments on the crib iron for the wages of hands which moved it but were not paid. By August, these cases were all settled before going to trial, and a barge was sent from Tampa to pick up the final rails from the crib. The story of Old Pete, aka the Slow and Wobbly, aka the Arcadia Gulf Coast and Lakeland Railroad, was definitely a strange one. It was the tale of two railroads, one involving the ignorance of the president, Anthony Peters, in agreeing to a contract that was probably misleading and costing several times more than was expected. The contracting firm mismanaged costs and caused waste, which led to several suits and a demise of the railroad. The other tale was an over-the-hill, slow engine with only 4 flat cars that ended up being the little engine that could. If it hadn't been for the mismanagement of the contractor, Old Pete may have still been called old, but probably not wobbly. The railroad was a boon for social get-togethers for the river and Sarasota communities. It was a godsend for moving citrus during harvest time, as well as truck farm vegetables and lumber for the mills. The railroad probably didn't run as often as the published schedule suggested, but in the end, the engineer and conductor were paid when the railroad was in service, which was most of the time. Thank you for attending the first train into Sarasota.